Zexthara stared at the holographic display floating above her desk, her 4 eyes blinking in sequence as she read the assignment details for the 3rd time. The blue glow from the projection cast strange shadows across her scaled face, highlighting the confusion that had been growing for the past hour. Analyze the military restraint patterns of the human species and provide strategic recommendations for future conflicts. The words seemed simple enough, but something about this assignment felt different from her previous studies at the Galactic Military Academy. She tapped her clawed finger against the desk, producing a soft clicking sound that echoed in her small dormitory room. Around her, the walls displayed her academic achievements over the past 3 cycles, strategic analysis awards, tactical simulation victories, and commendations for her research on 17 different alien species. Yet none of those studies had prepared her for this particular subject. The door to her room slid open with a soft hiss, and Commander Velka entered without waiting for permission. The older Veltaran moved with the confident stride of someone who had commanded fleets across the galaxy for over 2 centuries. His scarred hide bore the marks of dozens of battles, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency was known throughout the Empire. "Having trouble with your final thesis, student Zexthara?" Commander Velka asked, his voice carrying the rough edge that came from breathing the smoke of burning enemy ships. "Not trouble, sir," Zexthara replied, standing at attention. "As protocol demanded. I am simply trying to understand why the humans were chosen as my subject of study." Commander Velka moved to the window, gazing out at the Academy's training grounds where young Veltaran warriors practiced combat maneuvers. "The humans are an interesting case, student. They possess technology that rivals our own populations, that span hundreds of worlds and military forces that could pose a significant threat to any empire in the galaxy." "Then why have they not conquered their neighbors?" Zexthara asked. "Our intelligence reports show they have ended conflicts through negotiation rather than total victory. They have accepted territorial losses rather than fight to complete destruction. This behavior makes no sense from a strategic perspective." The commander turned back to face her, and Zexthara noticed something she had never seen before in his expression: a hint of uncertainty. "That is exactly why you need to study them. The Veltaran Empire has dominated this galaxy for 3,000 years because we understand our enemies. We know the Kretak fight for resources, the Zephyrians fight for honor, and the Mordain fight for religious purposes. But the humans, they fight for reasons we cannot comprehend." Zexthara accessed her personal datapad and pulled up the preliminary files she had gathered on human military actions over the past 50 years. The list was extensive, but what puzzled her most was not what the humans had done, but what they had chosen not to do. "Sir, I have reviewed 17 separate conflicts involving human forces. In each case, they possessed superior firepower and strategic advantages. Yet in 14 of those conflicts, they chose to end hostilities through diplomatic means rather than achieve total military victory." "Weakness," Commander Velka said with a dismissive gesture, "or perhaps cowardice. That is what the High Command believes, and that is what your thesis should prove." But as Zexthara looked at the data, she felt her scientific training rebel against such a simple explanation. Weak species did not develop antimatter weapons. Cowardly civilizations did not establish colonies in hostile star systems or send rescue missions into dangerous nebulae to save enemy survivors. "Commander, if I may ask, why is this research important now?" "The humans have been peaceful neighbors for decades. Their trade agreements have benefited the Empire, and they have never shown aggression toward our territory." Commander Velka was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Zexthara's scales prickle with unease. "Because the High Command is considering expansion into human space. If the humans are weak, as we suspect, then their worlds and resources could be claimed with minimal resistance. But if there is another explanation for their behavior, we need to know before we act." The implications of his words settled over Zexthara like a cold shadow. She had studied military history long enough to know what Volterran expansion meant for the species that stood in their way. Total conquest, complete subjugation, and the absorption of their technology and populations into the empire. It was the pattern they had followed for millennia. I understand, sir. I will begin my research immediately. After Commander Velka left, Zexthara returned to her desk and activated the Academy's central database. She input her security codes and began accessing files on human military capabilities, searching for evidence that would support the High Command's theory of human weakness. What she found instead made her pause in confusion. The humans had developed nuclear weapons over 400 years ago, yet they had used them in warfare only twice in their entire history. They possessed biological weapons capable of wiping out entire planetary populations, but these weapons remained sealed in research facilities, never deployed. Their space-based weapon platforms could reduce continents to ash, yet they used them only for asteroid mining and planetary defense. She pulled up records of recent human conflicts and found pattern after pattern of restraint. During the border war with the hegemony, human forces had surrounded 3 enemy worlds and held them under siege. Instead of orbital bombardment, they had negotiated the surrender of enemy forces and provided medical aid to wounded prisoners. When the Kitharan rebellion had threatened shipping lanes, human naval forces had disabled pirate vessels rather than destroying them, offering the captured crews opportunities to join human colonial security forces. Most puzzling of all was the Great Rescue of Altair 7, when the Zephyrian colony world had been struck by a plague that threatened to kill every living thing on the planet. It was human medical ships that had arrived first, despite the fact that the Zephyrians had been raiding human trade routes for decades. The humans had spent enormous resources developing a cure and had distributed it freely, asking nothing in return except a promise that the Zephyrians would stop their piracy. Zexthara leaned back in her chair, her 4 eyes blinking rapidly as she tried to process what she was reading. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The humans possessed the capability to dominate their region of space through force, but they consistently chose not to use that capability. She opened a communication channel to the Galactic Archive and requested access to historical records on human development. If she was going to understand why the humans behaved so differently from every other species she had studied, she needed to learn about their past. As the files began downloading, Zexthara felt a strange sensation in her chest, something that took her a moment to identify. It was excitement, the thrill of discovery that came when a researcher realized they were about to uncover something important. She had expected this assignment to be routine, a simple matter of documenting human weakness for the benefit of Volterran military planners. Instead, she was beginning to suspect that she was about to discover something far more significant. The humans were not weak, and they were not cowardly. They were something else entirely, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about warfare, conquest, and survival in a hostile galaxy. Outside her window, the twin suns of the Academy world were setting, casting long shadows across the training grounds, but Zexthara barely noticed. She was too absorbed in her research, too focused on the growing certainty that her thesis would not be what Commander Velka expected. That she was about to learn why the most dangerous species in the galaxy had chosen not to be dangerous, and that knowledge would change everything she believed about the nature of power itself. 3 days into her research, Zexthara found herself staring at data that made no sense according to everything she had learned about warfare and survival. The human military records showed a pattern so strange that she wondered if the files had been corrupted or deliberately altered to confuse enemy intelligence. She had spent the morning reading about something called the Geneva Conventions, a set of rules that humans had created to limit their own behavior during conflicts. The concept was so alien to her that she had to read the documents multiple times to believe they were real. Humans had actually agreed to restrictions on how they could fight their enemies, even when those enemies showed no such restraint. Knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she found a tall human male wearing the dark blue uniform of a retired Galactic fleet officer. His hair was gray and his face showed the lines that came with age, but his eyes held a sharpness that spoke of years spent making life and death decisions. "Student Zexthara? I am Admiral Kane. Commander Velka arranged for me to speak with you about your research project." Zexthara stepped back to allow the human into her room. She had never been this close to a human before, and she was surprised by how similar they seemed to her own people, despite the obvious physical differences. Kane moved with the same controlled precision she had observed in veteran Veltaran officers, but there was something different about his presence, something she could not quite identify. "Admiral Kane, I appreciate you taking time to help with my thesis. I have been studying human military history, but I must admit that much of what I have found confuses me." Kane sat in the chair she offered and smiled, an expression that showed his teeth in a way that should have seemed threatening, but somehow felt reassuring instead. "What specifically is confusing you?" Zexthara activated her datapad and pulled up the files she had been reviewing. "Your species developed nuclear weapons over 4 centuries ago. According to the technical specifications, these weapons could have allowed you to conquer your entire planet within months. Yet you used them only twice, and then you created agreements to limit their use. Why would you restrict your own power?" The Admiral's expression grew serious and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because we learned what those weapons could do. The first time we used them, we destroyed 2 cities and killed hundreds of thousands of people. The images of that destruction, the stories of the survivors, the long-term effects of radiation, they changed us as a species. But surely the tactical advantage was worth the cost? Your enemies would have been forced to surrender immediately." "They did surrender," Kane replied. "But the cost was higher than we had imagined. We realized that we had created weapons that could destroy not just our enemies, but our entire world. So we made a choice. We decided that some victories were too expensive to pursue." Zexthara looked at her notes, trying to understand the logic behind such a decision. In Veltaran culture, victory was the only consideration that mattered. The cost was irrelevant as long as the enemy was defeated and their resources claimed. "Admiral, I have also been reading about something called mutually assured destruction. Can you explain this concept to me?" Kane leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "It was a military doctrine we developed during our nuclear age. The idea was simple. If any nation launched nuclear weapons at another, the response would be so devastating that both sides would be destroyed. We created a situation where using our most powerful weapons meant committing suicide." "That makes no tactical sense," Zexthara said, her confusion growing. "Why would you deliberately create a scenario where you could not use your best weapons?" "Because it prevented anyone from using them at all. When the cost of winning a war is the destruction of your own civilization, you find other ways to resolve conflicts. We learned to negotiate, to compromise, to find solutions that allowed both sides to survive." Zexthara made notes on her datapad, but she found herself struggling to understand the human perspective. She decided to try a different approach. "Can you tell me about more recent conflicts?" "I have read about the Kitharan slave trade incident. Human forces ended the operation, but they used what appear to be minimal force tactics." Kane nodded. "The Kitharans were capturing members of developing species and selling them to mining operations in the outer systems. Our intelligence indicated that they had enslaved over 2 million beings across dozens of worlds. Your fleet could have destroyed their home world and ended the trade permanently. Instead, you conducted surgical strikes against their ships and facilities. Many of the slave traders escaped and continued their operations elsewhere. But we freed the slaves, Kane replied. And we did it without committing genocide against an entire species. Yes, some of the traitors escaped, but we captured their leadership and destroyed their infrastructure. The slave trade in that region has been reduced by over 90%. At the cost of allowing some criminals to escape justice, Zexthara pointed out. Justice and vengeance are not the same thing, Kane said quietly. We could have sterilized their worlds, but that would have made us no better than the slavers we were fighting against. We chose to be better. Zexthara saved her notes and pulled up another file. What about the Rigel conflict? Your forces provided medical aid to enemy soldiers, even while the battle was ongoing. This seems to violate basic military logic. Kane's expression softened, and for a moment he looked older than his years. I was there, commanding the medical frigate Compassion. We treated wounded from both sides, because they were people in need of help. The fact that they had been shooting at us an hour earlier did not change their right to medical care. But those same soldiers could have returned to fight against you once they recovered. Some of them did, Kane admitted. But others chose not to, and some of them joined our side after seeing how we treated prisoners and wounded. When you show mercy to your enemies, you sometimes discover that they do not have to remain your enemies. Zexthara sat back in her chair, trying to process what she was hearing. Every example Kane gave challenged the fundamental assumptions of Velteran military doctrine. The idea of showing mercy to enemies, of accepting tactical disadvantages, for moral reasons, of viewing war as something to be avoided rather than embraced, was completely foreign to her understanding of how intelligent species behaved. Admiral Kane, I must ask you directly, do humans avoid total war because you are unable to wage it effectively, or for some other reason? Kane was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Zexthara's scales prickle with an emotion she could not identify. We avoid total war because we know exactly how effectively we can wage it. The question is not whether we can destroy our enemies completely. The question is whether we should. I do not understand the distinction. Power without restraint is not strength, it is madness. A species that uses all of its capability in every conflict will eventually destroy everything around it, including itself. We learned this lesson the hard way, through trial and error and terrible mistakes. Now we try to teach it to others through example. Kane stood to leave, but he paused at the door. Student Zexthara, may I offer you some advice about your research? Of course, Admiral. Do not assume that restraint equals weakness. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is choose not to use all of their strength. Sometimes the bravest thing a warrior can do is find a way to avoid fighting. After Kane left, Zexthara sat alone in her room, staring at the data on her screen. Everything the Admiral had told her contradicted her expectations, but it also explained the pattern she had observed in human behavior. They were not weak or cowardly. They were something else entirely. She opened a new file and began typing her preliminary observations. For the first time since beginning this research, she felt like she was starting to understand the humans. But that understanding brought with it a growing unease about what Commander Velka and the High Command planned to do with her findings. 2 weeks after her conversation with Admiral Kane, Zexthara found herself standing in the docking bay of the human starship Constellation. The massive vessel stretched nearly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull a dark gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Warning lights blinked along its weapon ports, and sensor arrays covered its surface like mechanical eyes watching everything around them. Commander Velka had arranged for her to observe human military exercises firsthand. He believed that seeing human forces in action would prove their weakness and provide the evidence needed to support the High Command's expansion plans. But as Zexthara looked at the ship's impressive design, she wondered if her commander had made a mistake in his assumptions. Welcome aboard the Constellation, said a voice behind her. Zexthara turned to see a human female wearing the uniform of a ship captain. The woman was shorter than Admiral Kane, but carried herself with the same confident bearing that marked experienced military leaders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her brown eyes held the alertness of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in dangerous situations. "I am Captain Lisa Morgan," the woman continued, extending her hand in the human gesture of greeting. "Admiral Kane told me about your research project. We are happy to help however we can." Zexthara carefully took the captain's hand, still adjusting to human customs. The grip was firm but not threatening, another example of the restrained behavior she had been studying. "Thank you for allowing me to observe your exercises, Captain Morgan. I hope to gain a better understanding of human military capabilities. I think you will find our demonstration educational." Captain Morgan replied with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Chief Cooper will show you to the observation deck, and then we can begin." A young human male stepped forward and introduced himself as Danny Cooper, the ship's chief weapons officer. As he led Zexthara through the ship's corridors, she noticed how different the atmosphere was from Velteran military vessels. The crew members she passed seemed relaxed and friendly, greeting her with curious but welcoming expressions. There was none of the rigid fear and aggressive posturing that characterize her own people's ships. "This is your first time on a human warship?" Cooper asked as they walked. "Yes, and I admit I am surprised by what I see. Your crew seems very calm." Cooper laughed, a sound that seemed genuine rather than mocking. "We take our jobs seriously, but we do not see the point in being miserable while we do them. A crew that trusts each other and enjoys working together is more effective than one held together by fear and discipline alone." They arrived at the HFY observation deck, a large room with transparent walls that provided a clear view of space around the ship. Other human officers were already there, preparing equipment and reviewing procedures. Zexthara noticed that several of them nodded politely to her, showing none of the suspicion or hostility she might have expected from potential enemies. "The exercise will begin in a few minutes," Cooper explained, activating a holographic display that showed the surrounding area. "We will be conducting weapons tests against a series of asteroids that have been positioned at various distances from the ship." Captain Morgan's voice came over the ship's communication system. "All hands, prepare for weapons demonstration. Target asteroids are confirmed clear of navigation hazards and mining claims. Weapons systems to standby mode." Zexthara watched as the crew around her began their preparations. Each person moved with practiced efficiency, checking instruments and confirming readiness. But what struck her most was the lack of excitement or bloodlust. These humans were about to demonstrate their capacity for destruction, yet they treated it as routine work rather than an opportunity for glory. "Primary plasma cannons charging," reported a technician. "Target lock established on asteroid cluster Alpha." Through the observation windows, Zexthara could see the target asteroids floating in space about 50 kilometers from the ship. They were large chunks of rock and metal, each one roughly the size of a city building. According to the tactical display, they represented enemy installations for the purpose of the exercise. "Firing solution confirmed," Cooper announced. "All safety protocols active, commencing demonstration." The first weapon to fire was a plasma cannon mounted on the ship's forward hull. A brilliant beam of superheated energy lanced out toward the target asteroid, striking it dead center. The rock exploded in a shower of glowing fragments, completely destroyed in less than a second. The power display showed that the weapon had used only 30% of its maximum output. "Target Alpha eliminated," reported the technician. "Moving to secondary targets." Over the next hour, Zexthara watched the humans demonstrate weapon after weapon. Particle beams that could slice through asteroid fields like cutting tools. Antimatter torpedoes that warped space itself when they detonated. Defensive shields that absorbed direct hits from simulated enemy fire without showing any strain. Each weapon was more powerful than the last, and each one was operated with the same calm professionalism. But what truly disturbed Zexthara was not the weapons themselves, but the faces of the humans operating them. She had expected to see the savage joy of warriors testing their tools of destruction. Instead, she saw only grim concentration and careful attention to safety procedures. These people were demonstrating the ability to destroy worlds, yet they treated it as a necessary but unpleasant duty. "Impressive firepower," she said to Cooper during a break between tests. Cooper nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Power is easy to create. The hard part is knowing when and how to use it responsibly." "What do you mean?" Cooper gestured toward the tactical display, which showed the debris from the destroyed asteroids. "Every weapon we just tested could be used against populated worlds. The plasma cannons could sterilize continents. The antimatter torpedoes could crack planets apart. But having the ability to do something does not mean we should do it. Then why develop such weapons at all? Because sometimes you need overwhelming force to prevent a conflict from escalating. If your enemies know that you can destroy them completely, they are more likely to negotiate instead of fighting. Peace through strength, we call it." The demonstration continued with defensive systems and support technologies. Zexthara watched medical drones that could treat wounded soldiers in the middle of battle. She saw communication systems designed to translate languages in real time, allowing human forces to communicate with alien populations they encountered. She observed supply systems that could produce food, medicine, and shelter for refugee populations. "You carry humanitarian equipment on a warship?" she asked. "War creates suffering," Captain Morgan explained, having joined them on the observation deck. "We believe it is our responsibility to minimize that suffering whenever possible. Sometimes, the most important battles are fought with medical supplies and food rations, not weapons." As the exercises concluded, Zexthara found herself more confused than ever. The humans had demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded those of most Velteran ships, yet they seemed reluctant to discuss their weapons with pride or enthusiasm. Instead, they focused on their defensive systems, their medical equipment, and their protocols for protecting civilian populations. "Captain Morgan, may I ask you a direct question?" "Of course." "Why do your people choose restraint over decisive victory? From what I have observed today, you could overwhelm most enemies quickly and completely. Yet your military doctrine emphasizes limited engagement and protection of non-combatants. This seems to contradict basic survival instincts." Captain Morgan was quiet for a moment, looking out at the debris field left by their weapons tests. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made Zexthara's scales tingle with unease. "Student Zexthara, what you have seen today represents perhaps 1% of our actual military capability. We demonstrated these weapons because they are the ones we are comfortable showing to potential allies and enemies. There are other systems aboard this ship, other capabilities that we hope never to use." "What kind of capabilities?" "The kind that could end civilizations. The kind that could render entire star systems uninhabitable for millennia. The kind that would make us no better than the monsters we fight against." Captain Morgan turned to face Zexthara directly, and the young alien saw something in the human's eyes that chilled her to the bone. It was not fear or uncertainty. It was the terrible knowledge of someone who understood exactly what they were capable of, and who had chosen to carry that burden rather than use it. "We practice restraint not because we are weak, but because we know what happens when restraint fails. That knowledge shapes everything we do." 5 days after the weapons demonstration, Zexthara sat in her guest quarters aboard the Constellation, staring at the research notes that covered her desk. The data she had collected painted a picture that contradicted everything Commander Velka had told her about human weakness. If anything, the humans appeared to be far more dangerous than the Velteran High Command realized. She had spent hours reviewing the technical specifications of the weapons she had witnessed. Even the basic plasma cannons could level cities, and the antimatter torpedoes possessed enough destructive force to shatter moons. Yet Captain Morgan had insisted that these represented only a small fraction of human military capability. The comment had haunted Zexthara for days, raising questions she was afraid to ask. A soft chime indicated someone was requesting entry to her quarters. When the door opened, Captain Morgan stepped inside, carrying a sealed datapad and wearing an expression that seemed both serious and sad. "Student Zexthara, I have been thinking about our conversation after the weapons demonstration. You asked about our military restraint, and I believe I owe you a more complete answer." Zexthara set aside her notes and gave the captain her full attention. Something in Morgan's tone suggested that this conversation would be different from their previous discussions. "I appreciate any information you can provide, Captain. My research has raised more questions than it has answered." Captain Morgan sat down across from her and placed the datapad on the table between them. The device bore security seals that Zexthara recognized as indicating highly classified material. "What I am about to show you is not normally shared with non-human observers. However, Admiral Kane and I have discussed your research, and we believe you need to understand the full scope of human military capability if you are going to write an accurate report." Zexthara felt her scales prickle with anticipation and unease. "What kind of information?" "The truth about why we practice restraint. The truth about what happens when that restraint is removed." Captain Morgan activated the datapad, and a holographic display appeared above the table. "What you witnessed during our exercises represents what we call Tier 1 engagement protocols. These are the weapons and tactics we use in conventional conflicts." The hologram showed technical diagrams of the weapons Zexthara had observed, along with their specifications and capabilities. The destructive potential was impressive, but she had already studied these systems extensively. "However, Captain," Morgan continued, "human military doctrine includes 2 additional tiers of escalation. Tier 2 protocols are used only when conventional forces prove insufficient to achieve strategic objectives." The hologram changed, displaying weapon systems that made Zexthara's breathing apparatus work harder. She saw designs for planet crackers that could split worlds apart from the inside, stellar manipulators that could cause stars to collapse or explode, gravity bombs that could create artificial black holes. Each weapon was accompanied by casualty estimates that numbered in the billions. "These weapons exist?" Zexthara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "They exist, but they have never been used in actual combat. The mere knowledge that we possess them has been sufficient to prevent conflicts that might otherwise have escalated beyond control." Zexthara studied the technical specifications, trying to comprehend the scale of destruction these weapons could cause. A single stellar manipulator could destroy entire solar systems. The gravity bombs could eliminate fleets of ships by creating localized space-time distortions. The planet crackers could turn thriving worlds into asteroid fields within hours. "But surely these represent your ultimate military capability?" Captain Morgan's expression grew even more somber. "No, these are Tier 2 weapons. There is one more level." The holographic display changed again, and Zexthara felt her blood turn cold. The new designs were beyond her comprehension, representing technologies that seemed to violate the basic laws of physics. She saw temporal disruption devices that could erase events from history, reality anchors that could alter the fundamental constants of the universe, consciousness transfer weapons that could eliminate entire species by removing their ability to think. "Tier 3 protocols," Captain Morgan said quietly. "These weapons were developed not for conquest, but as the ultimate deterrent. They represent humanity's promise to the galaxy that if total war becomes unavoidable, we will ensure that no one survives to repeat the mistake." Zexthara stared at the hologram, unable to speak. The weapons displayed before her could eliminate not just civilizations, but the very possibility of life itself. They were instruments of such complete destruction that using them would mean the end of everything. Why, she finally managed to ask, why would you create such things? Because we learned the alternative. Captain Morgan touched a control, and the hologram showed historical records from Earth's past. Centuries ago, our planet came very close to destroying itself through nuclear war. We realized that as our technology advanced, our conflicts would become more and more destructive. Eventually, we would develop weapons that could eliminate all life in the galaxy. The display showed theoretical projections of how galactic warfare might evolve without restraint. Species after species developing more powerful weapons, using them without limitation until the galaxy itself became uninhabitable. So we made a choice, Captain Morgan continued. We decided to develop the ultimate weapons ourselves and then never use them. We became the galaxy's insurance policy against total destruction. If any species attempts to wage unlimited war, we have the capability to ensure that everyone loses. Zexthara looked at the captain with new understanding. You are not trying to conquer the galaxy. You are trying to preserve it. Exactly. Every conflict we engage in, every negotiation we conduct, every act of mercy we show to our enemies, is part of a larger strategy to prevent the kind of total war that would require us to use our ultimate capabilities. But how do other species know about these weapons? If they have never been used, how do they serve as a deterrent? Captain Morgan smiled grimly. Occasionally, we find it necessary to provide hints. A classified document that accidentally gets leaked to enemy intelligence. A weapons test conducted in an empty system where long-range sensors can observe the results. A diplomatic conversation where we mention capabilities we hope never to demonstrate. The hologram showed records of such incidents over the past century. Zexthara saw intelligence reports from various species that had discovered fragments of information about human weapons development. Each report had led to the same conclusion. Humanity possessed military capabilities that made direct confrontation inadvisable. The Velteran Empire, Zexthara said slowly, has never received such hints. No, they have not. Until recently, your people showed no interest in expanding into human space. But our intelligence indicates that may be changing. Zexthara felt a chill run through her body. You know about the High Command's plans? We know about your research assignment. We know that Commander Velka believes humans are weak and suitable for conquest. We know that your thesis will be used to determine whether the Velteran Empire launches an expansion campaign into our territory. Captain Morgan leaned forward, her expression intense. That is why I am showing you this information. Your people need to understand what they would be starting if they attack human worlds. We do not want to use our ultimate weapons, but we will not allow our species to be enslaved or destroyed. You want me to warn them. I want you to tell them the truth. Human restraint is not weakness. It is the most powerful force in the galaxy, because it is the only thing standing between civilization and complete annihilation. Zexthara looked at the holographic display one more time, memorizing the images of weapons that could unmake reality itself. She understood now why the humans seemed so calm and professional during combat. They were not fighting for conquest or glory. They were fighting to avoid having to use the terrible knowledge they carried. Captain Morgan, how do you live with such responsibility? By remembering that the burden of power is the price of civilization. Someone has to carry the weight of ultimate capability and choose never to use it. We decided that someone should be us. The hologram faded, leaving them sitting in the dim light of the quarters. Zexthara realized that her thesis would not be what Commander Velka expected. Instead of providing justification for Velteran expansion, she would be delivering A warning that might save both species from a war that no one could win. 3 weeks after returning to the Galactic Military Academy, Zexthura sat in her dormitory room, staring at the completed thesis that would determine the fate of 2 civilizations. The document contained everything she had learned about human military capabilities, but she knew that Commander Velka would not be pleased with her conclusions. Her final interview had been with Dr. Peter Hayes, a human philosopher who served as a civilian advisor to the Galactic Fleet. The elderly man had helped her understand the philosophical foundation behind human military restraint, explaining concepts that challenged everything she thought she knew about power and survival. The door chimed, and Commander Velka entered without waiting for permission. His expression was eager, and Zexthara could see that he expected her research to confirm his beliefs about human weakness. "Student Zexthara, I trust your thesis is complete. The High Command is eager to review your findings and proceed with expansion planning." Zexthara stood at attention, holding her datapad containing the thesis. "Yes, sir. My research is complete, though I believe you may find the conclusions unexpected." "Unexpected how? Did you discover some hidden weakness we can exploit?" "No, sir. I discovered why weakness is not the correct explanation for human behavior." Zexthara transferred her thesis to the commander's datapad and watched his expression change as he began reading. Commander Velka's eyes widened as he scrolled through the technical specifications and capability assessments. His scales shifted from their normal green to the pale yellow that indicated shock and disbelief. "These weapon specifications cannot be accurate. No species possesses this level of destructive capability. I observed demonstrations personally, sir. I interviewed human military officers and reviewed classified documents. The humans possess weapons that could eliminate entire star systems, and they have deliberately chosen not to use them." Commander Velka looked up from the datapad, his expression a mixture of confusion and anger. "Then why have they not conquered the galaxy? If they possess such power, what prevents them from establishing an empire?" Zexthara had expected this question, and she had prepared her answer carefully. "According to Dr. Hayes, the human philosopher I interviewed, their restraint comes from a concept they call moral responsibility. They believe that possessing the power to destroy something creates an obligation to protect it instead. That is nonsense. Survival requires the use of all available advantages. Any species that voluntarily limits its own power will be destroyed by those who do not. Sir, the humans learned that lesson differently. Dr. Hayes told me about their history, about how they nearly destroyed themselves with primitive nuclear weapons centuries ago. They realized that unlimited conflict would eventually lead to the extinction of all intelligent life." Commander Velka set down the datapad and began pacing around the small room. Zexthara could see him struggling to accept information that contradicted his fundamental beliefs about warfare and survival. Even if this is true, it represents an opportunity. If the humans are unwilling to use their full capabilities, we can defeat them with conventional forces. "No, sir." Zexthara pulled up a specific section of her thesis. "The humans have established clear escalation protocols. They will use progressively more powerful weapons if their existence is threatened. Captain Morgan made it clear that they would rather destroy the galaxy than allow their species to be enslaved." "You spoke with this Captain Morgan about classified military doctrine?" "She volunteered the information, sir. The humans wanted me to understand the full scope of their capabilities. They know about the High Command's expansion plans." Commander Velka stopped pacing and stared at her. How could they know about classified Velteran strategic planning? Zexthara had dreaded this moment, but she knew she had to tell the complete truth. "Sir, according to Captain Morgan, human intelligence services have been monitoring our communications for years. They know about the expansion plans. They know about my research assignment. And they know what the High Command intends to do with my findings. Then why did they cooperate with your research?" Why provide you with information that could be used against them? Because they wanted to prevent a war that would destroy both our species. The humans prefer negotiation over conflict, but they will not allow themselves to be conquered. They showed me their capabilities as a warning, not a threat. Commander Velka returned to reading the thesis, his expression growing darker with each page. Zexthara watched him review the sections about human humanitarian efforts, their rules of engagement, and their philosophy of minimal necessary force. This makes no sense from a military perspective, he said finally. These humans waste resources, protecting their enemies, limit their own tactical options, and refuse to exploit advantages that could ensure victory. How have they survived as a species? Sir, according to Dr. Hayes, they have thrived because their approach creates allies instead of enemies. Species that have been shown mercy by human forces often become trading partners, or even military allies. The humans have built a network of relationships that provides them with resources and intelligence throughout the galaxy, built through weakness and sentiment rather than strength and fear. No, sir. Built through strength that chooses to be gentle. Dr. Hayes explained it to me, using a concept from their ancient philosophy. He said that true power is not the ability to destroy your enemies, but the ability to turn them into friends. Commander. Velka closed the datapad and looked directly at Zexthara. Student, are you recommending that the Velteran Empire abandon its expansion plans based on this research? Zexthara had prepared for this question as well, knowing that her answer would determine not only her academic future, but possibly the fate of millions of lives. Sir, I am recommending that the High Command reconsider the strategic value of expansion into human space. The potential gains do not justify the risks involved. A conflict with humanity would likely result in casualties that far exceed any possible benefits. And if the High Command chooses to proceed anyway? Zexthara referred to her notes from the final interview with Dr. Hayes. The old human had been very clear about what would happen if diplomatic solutions failed. Dr. Hayes told me that humans have contingency plans for every possible scenario. If the Velteran Empire attacks human worlds, the response will be escalated force designed to end the conflict as quickly as possible. If the Empire threatens human survival, the response will be total warfare using capabilities that could eliminate all life in this galaxy. You believe these threats? Sir, after observing human military exercises and reviewing their weapon specifications, I believe they have the capability to carry out these threats. More importantly, I believe they would prefer to avoid using that capability if given any alternative. Commander Velka was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with the implications of her research. Finally, he asked the question that Zexthara had been expecting. What do you recommend as our next course of action? Diplomatic contact, sir. The humans have indicated that they are willing to discuss trade agreements, territorial boundaries, and mutual defense pacts. They prefer negotiation over conflict, and they have a long history of honoring agreements with species that treat them fairly. The High Command will not be pleased with this recommendation. Sir, the High Command tasked me with providing an accurate assessment of human military capabilities and strategic options. That is what I have done. The fact that the truth is different from our expectations does not change the reality of the situation. Commander Velka picked up the datapad containing her thesis and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back to face her one more time. Student Zexthara, are you certain about your conclusions? Once I present this to the High Command, there will be no opportunity to revise your findings. I am certain, sir. The humans are not weak, and they are not suitable targets for conquest. They are something far more dangerous and far more valuable. They are potential allies who possess the power to destroy the galaxy and the wisdom to choose not to use it. After Commander Velka left, Zexthara sat alone in her room, wondering what the High Command would decide to do with her research. She had done her duty as a scholar and a soldier, providing accurate information regardless of whether it supported her superiors' preferences, but she had also done something more. She had potentially saved both species from a war that would have ended in mutual destruction. By revealing the truth about human restraint, she had given the Velteran Empire the opportunity to choose cooperation over conquest. As she looked out at the stars visible through her window, Zexthara realized that she had learned something more valuable than military intelligence. She had learned that true strength came not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when destruction was unnecessary. The humans had taught her that mercy was not weakness, but the highest form of power. And perhaps, if the High Command was wise enough to listen, that lesson could become the foundation for a peaceful future between their species.